Hello, and welcome to My Week in Baseball. I'm your host, Phil Estruth Harrison. You're listening to episode number 6. This episode is published as a podcast on Buzzsprout and Spotify, and is also available in a video version on YouTube. This episode is the first with my new intro music, specifically produced for the show by Ari Estruth and the amazing crew at Brunjo Productions out of Nashville. Brunjo specializes in music production, from songwriting and recording services to final production and album cover design. Learn more at brunjo.com. That's BRUNJO.com. As it turns out, Ari is also a big baseball fan, so we'll get him on the show sometime soon to share his enthusiasm and insights into the game we all love. All right, today's topics are a tribute to Irish hurling, a look at two stars from the 1950s and 60s, and league batting averages over time, and how important they really are or aren't. Of course, we'll also have a timely Blimerick, our blast from the past, and the cap of the day. So let's get right to it. Today's cap of the day is the Boston Red Sox, but it's not your traditional Red Sox cap. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see it. It's a pale yellow Red Sox cap with a deep blue and a navy blue Boston B that's outlined with a little white edging around the B. So it's the standard style cap in the sense of the B logo, but with the pale yellow and the deep navy blue Boston B. So this is actually a cap I got from my wife a few years ago when I was in Boston for a Red Sox game. Got to see one at Fenway Park, which was great. And I like that they're doing some of these, what I would call non-traditional caps now, where they're doing caps in different colors and just making it more interesting for us fans to purchase a cap that kind of suits our style. So why the Boston Red Sox cap today? Well, recently, I took a trip to Ireland, and Boston has a strong connection to Ireland. In fact, we learned that there are 32 counties in Ireland, and Boston, due to its strong immigrant population, is said to be Ireland's 33rd county. So we'll take a quick tribute here to the Irish sport of hurling. Now, each county in Ireland has its own hurling team, and hurling is Ireland's national game. It's an ancient game, the oldest known field game in the world. It's also the most baseball-like game in Ireland, minus the bases. But there is a ball called a sliotar and a bat referred to as a stick. Now, the ball is very similar to a baseball in that it has a cork center. It is covered in leather and has the same kind of raised seam stitching pattern as a baseball, but it is slightly smaller by a few millimeters and just a little bit softer. The sticks are made of ash, as are most wooden baseball bats, and it's nearly identical in length to a baseball bat. However, it's flat on both sides, so you can balance a ball on it, and it's shaped more like a hockey stick with a protruding end. So what you do is you hit the ball with the stick to move it down the field and to score goals by getting it past the goalie, who also has a stick. Or you can flick the ball over the top of the goal for a single point, sort of like a field goal in football, as you have to get it between two uprights that are above the goal. So goals are worth 3 points. That means getting it past the goalie. Or you get 1 point if you just get it over the top of the goal between the uprights. So just a little bit of background there. That is Irish hurling. It's a pretty exciting thing to watch. You might even want to look up Irish hurling on YouTube just for fun. And I did get a chance to try this during a trip to Ireland. At least I got to balance the ball on the stick, try to do what I could with it. It could be a fun game. Take a lot of practice. Next up is our blast from the past. And today, our blast from the past is going to focus on a player from the 1950s and 60s, Harvey Kuenn. This came about during a recent discussion with my father about some of his favorite players and teams that he remembers as a Detroit Tigers fan during that era, and Kuenn was one of his favorites. So a little bit about Kuenn. He won Rookie of the Year in 1953, leading the league with 209 hits and a 308 batting average. He actually led the league in hits 4 times. He led the league in doubles 3 times, and he won the batting title in 1959, batting .353 with a .903 OPS, which was 3rd in the league, and a 141 OPS plus. So remember that 141, 100 is the baseline. That means he was 41% better than the average player offensively, that's like MVP caliber production there. His batting average career, 303, career on base percentage, 357, career OPS, 765, which is an OPS plus of 108. So it means for his career, he was 8% above league average, which is pretty decent. In his 8 years with Detroit, though, he was a bit better. He had a 314 batting average, a 360 on base percentage, and a 112 OPS plus. So for his 8 years in Detroit, he was actually 12% better than league average. And he played for the Tigers kind of during his prime, ages 21 through 28. So great time to have him on your team. He was an 8-time All-Star, and you could really count it as a 10-time All-Star if you count 1959 and 1960, when 2 All-Star games were played in those years. And defensively, although he was known as a shortstop, he actually played more career games in the outfield. And he was pretty good defensively. These are some stats I had to do a little research on, because as we all know, defense seems to be a harder thing to measure than offense. But his defensive WAR, his defensive wins above replacement in 1954 in the American League was 1.7, which, what does that mean? Well, it's hard to know without some context, but he was 3rd in the league in defensive WAR as a shortstop. So at that time, there weren't as many teams in the league, but that's a good defensive player there. And in 1957, he had the fewest errors at short. In 1958, he was 1st in the league in range factor per game as an outfielder. He got to an average of 2.64 balls per game and led the league in range factor. In 1959, with a .990 fielding percentage, he led the league in fielding percentage as a right fielder. So he was a good defensive player, both at short and in the outfield. In April of 1960, the Tigers traded him to Cleveland for Rocky Colavito. And this is a trade that got my father and I talking, because at least at the time, it wasn't the most popular trade. Batting average was something that was really considered to be an important thing in that era. And we'll talk more about batting average later in the broadcast. So we were trading, the Tigers were trading Kuenn, who had previously won the batting title, to Cleveland for Rocky Colavito, who had previously won the home run title. So you're trading a good hitter for a good slugger. And I think at that time, that wasn't the most popular thing. But as it turned out, it was a good trade for the Tigers. So Colavito was a slugger who averaged 30 plus homers a year, and he played 4 seasons for the Tigers. And in those 4 seasons, he had 35, 45, 37, and 22 home runs. So decent power, especially for that era. During that period, he had a .271 batting average, on base plus slugging, an OPS of 865, which was good that's an OPS plus of 130. So that means during those seasons with Detroit, he was 30% above league average, which is extremely good. He was a corner outfielder, left and right field. And in 1962 and 63, as a left fielder, he led the league in fielding percentage and range factor, meaning he made few errors, and he also got to a lot of balls. So That's great. So he was a surprisingly good defender as well. If you look at, though, their career WAR, Colavito had 44.8 career wins above replacement in his 14 seasons, compared to Harvey Kuenn, who had 26 career WAR in 15 seasons. So Kuenn even played one season more. So a significant difference in WAR. But you've also got to factor in the positions that they played. You usually consider shortstop to be a more key position, although certainly Kuenn also played some outfield during his career. So there's that trade-off. And Colavito for the Indians only played one season before he was dealt again. And you'd have to really delve into it to see if Cleveland came out okay on that. I took a brief look at it. The two players he was traded for did not stand out in my memory. So I think that the Tigers came out better on that trade, but certainly I can see it would be hard to trade a popular player that way. And you don't see that much in the present era with free agency. You don't very seldom see two star players traded for each other to meet the needs of the various teams. So an interesting trade, exciting trade at its time. I think Detroit ended up getting the better part of the deal in that. So what that leads us to is a little bit of talking about batting averages and how those were important in the 50s and the 60s versus the most recent decade. So this is something my dad and I got talking about. It seemed like batting average in the past, during the era he was growing up, was really important. And if you were hitting, if you weren't hitting at least 250 and really more than that, if you were hitting below 250, you were really probably headed for the minors, or at least that would have been the fans' perception that you were likely a borderline player headed toward the minors. Of course, today we commonly see players who are hitting in the 220s, sometimes even lower, but they may remain on the team because of their ability to take walks and know how to deal with launch angle, hitting the ball in the air and getting the home runs and the doubles, getting those extra base hits. So the strategy has certainly changed. So that made me think about, though, how much different is batting average from that era that my father remembers with and the era most recent decade. So what I did is I have compared the several things, but we'll start with batting average for the 1950s. So I'm looking at the 10-year period from 1951 to 1960, and I'm comparing it to the most recently completed decade. That would be the 10-year period from 2011 to 2020. I'm going to admit up front, 2020, there were less games played, right? That was the pandemic shortened season. It was a 60-game season. I did not adjust for that in my stats here. So if you're a purist with the stats, you could say that these might not be a perfect comparison, but I think over the course of a decade, I'm fairly confident that the difference in the fewer games played in 2020 will have little impact on this overall discussion. So I'll just say through that decade, 1951 through 1960. So we'll say the decade of the 50s, and we'll compare it to the decade of the 20 teens, 2011 through 2020. In the highest batting average during the era in the 1950s was 264. This is the highest league batting average. The lowest league batting average during that period was 253. In comparison to the recent decade, 2011 through 2020, the highest was 255. And if we look at that decade in the 1950s, there was only one time in that whole decade that the league batting average was below 255. So that tells you something right there. But overall, the difference wasn't as much as I might have thought it would be. So the average batting average in the decade of the 1950s for the entire league was 258. The average batting average during the 2011 to 2020 period was 252. Definitely lower, 6 points lower, if you will. And if you do it as a percentage, it's about 2.5% lower. So certainly the batting average is a bit lower in the most recently completed decade, but it's not as much as I might have thought. So I thought, well, what does that tell me? That in itself doesn't tell me a whole lot. So I started to look at a few other things for comparison. I also looked at OPS, on base plus slugging, and compared them for those same eras. So the average OPS during the 1950s was 719. The average OPS during the 2011 to 2020 period was 729. So a 10-point difference in OPS. If you do that as a percentage, it's about 1.5%. Again, it doesn't seem that significant, but certainly on base plus slugging is higher in what I'll call the current era, and batting average is lower, although again, not as much as I might have thought. So that made me think about, well, how about runs? Are we scoring a different number of runs? We're playing the game differently? If batting average really was so important in the 1950s and it's less so now, did that affect the number of runs scored per game? So let's take a look at that. In the 1950s, the average number of runs per game was 4.39. In the 2011 to 2020 period, the average runs per game was 4.42. It's only a difference of what, 0.03. It's a marginal difference, and it's about 0.5%. So I was surprised to find that out. I actually expected that the number of runs per game in the modern era, or the current era, I'll call it, would have been more significant than that. So the number of runs is fairly close, really quite close. So what's different? So I looked at one more stat, and that's home runs per game. Home runs per game, big difference. In the 1950s, the number of home runs hit per game was 0.85, so less than one per game, 15% actually below one per game. The number of home runs hit per game in the most recent era, the 2011 to 2020 era, was 1.10, so 10% more than one per game. And that ends up being quite a difference. So that's a 0.26 difference in home runs per game. If you do it as a percentage, 30%. There are 30% more home runs per game, more frequent they hit a home run than in the 1950s. So I think, what does that tell me? Well, we clearly have much more of an emphasis on home runs, the three true outcomes, as you'll call it, of striking out, walking, or hitting a home run. We also saw that on base plus slugging is a bit higher. So that would lean, since slugging, home runs are involved in slugging. Also on base could be affected with walks. That would be something I would need to look at a little more closely though. But I think the main thing I learned from this, so even though batting average was higher in the 1950s, and even though on base plus slugging was higher in the most recent era, the runs per game were nearly the same. The really big difference is home runs per game. And what that means to me is it's really the style of play. There was a lot more small ball play, a lot more bunting, a lot more hit and run, which you hardly ever see anymore. It was just really a different way of playing the game. And in the current era, we're seeing, much more emphasis on the long ball, on power, on slugging percentage. So it's not so much that the number of runs have changed. It's really just an emphasis on the way runs are scored is the big difference. But it was interesting to me that the batting average difference between 258 in the 50s and 252 in the current era is not as much as I would have expected. Although the batting average this year in 2022 is quite a bit lower. I'm going to try to look that up really quickly here. And we're going to use baseballreference.com, which is going to be batting average year by year. And baseballreference.com has a great list for this. So what we're going to look at in 2022, which of course we've only played about a quarter of a season or so, but the batting average this season is only 238. That's across all 30 teams. So that is a big drop, and it will be interesting to see if that continues. In fact, last year, 2021, which also wasn't in our data set, the league batting average for a full season was only 244. So it's starting to look like it's trending down more so just in the last 2 or 3 seasons. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But anyway, that was my analysis of batting averages. And thanks to my dad for kind of bringing up that topic with me. I think it's pretty interesting to do that kind of research. So now it's time for our Blimerick. That's our baseball limerick of the week, which we do on every broadcast. And this Blimerick is a tribute to the 1950s Tigers. Now, before I say the Blimerick, there'll be a few players' names involved in the Blimerick, but 2 players I didn't list, but I thought this was interesting. In researching this, the 1958 Tigers roster included Billy Martin at shortstop, who of course goes on to become a famous or infamous manager for the Yankees and the A's, and also Charlie Lau as a backup catcher. And I don't know how many of you remember Charlie Lau. I don't think as a player, most anybody would remember him. However, he was a great hitting coach in what would be the 1980s, maybe into the 1990s. And his prime disciple was George Brett, who batted .390 in the early 1980s. And that was the highest batting average since anyone has hit 400. Anyway, interesting to me that 2 players, Billy Martin and Charlie Lau, who went on to be noted for things later in their careers, were on that 1958 roster. So without further ado, here's the Blimerick as a tribute to the 1950s Detroit Tigers. Here we go. With Kaline and Keene, Ray Boone and Jim Bunning, the 50s Tigers were decent, though not really stunning. Those damn Yankees would finish in first. Tiger hopes would surely be burst. Wait till next year. We'll give them a running. All right. So that's all we have for the day. Join us next time, because honestly, what could be better than talking baseball? Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Phil Estruth Harrison. We'll see you next time on My Week in Baseball.